Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the May 17th, 2023 meeting of the Historic Preservation Commission for the City of Calabasas. So let's do a quick roll call here.
Justin Ford, Commissioner Ford.
Michael Human.
I'm Mark Silverman.
Carol Steffen.
Matthew Hosena.
Okay. We're going to get into the Pledge of Allegiance here. Do I have a volunteer to lead us? Okay, Justin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, very nice. Okay, I need an approval of the minutes.
So moved.
So moved, okay.
I'll second that.
Very nice, okay, the minutes have been moved and approved. Anybody having any announcements or introductions? Oh, we need to vote, sorry. Okay, we've got a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion passes 5-0. Okay. Announcements and introductions. Anybody have anything? No? Michael? No? Sarah? No? Okay, moving right along. Oral communications and public comment. I don't see anybody out here, so we'll move right along here. We need the approval for the minutes for February 15th, 2022. Oh, it says 22 on mine.
They corrected it.
That's what we just did.
Oh,
It's okay.
You approved that instead of the agenda, but I think
all
we're
right.
fine.
We're good.
Oh, that's what we you're right. Okay, here, we're gonna go on to new business. Investigation of oak tree in Old Town for eligibility of consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission.
Okay,
This is a topic that came to staff's attention, not because we haven't noticed the oak tree. You can't miss it, but because, of course, members of your commission have brought it to our attention, some interest anyway, in discussing the possibility of recognizing the tree and history that could be associated with the tree directly or indirectly, and the possibility of using the tree, for lack of a better word, as a vehicle to communicate some of that history. So I prepared the written report, and I'm just going to summarize some of it now. And to remind you, in Zoom kind of environments like we've been in for so long, having presentations were understood to kind of be automatic because that's how everybody could follow, because we weren't in the same room. We do try to do presentations nonetheless, even when attendance by the public would appear to be low, because you do have CTV broadcast, both live and in recorded form. And by having a summary of the written staff report in this fashion, it helps the public. So I will apologize, but I'm giving that disclaimer up front, but I'll apologize if any of this is redundant, but it's somewhat necessary. Okay? All right, so obviously, as I mentioned, the tree is unmistakable. It's located in the middle of a property that has two office buildings on either side. This is a property that happens to be owned by the Leona Adobe Association, who own, of course, the Leona Adobe property across the street, which includes the cantina, by the way, and a lot of people don't know that. So the municipal code designates a heritage oak tree as any tree with a diameter at the 4.5 foot level above grade at 24 inches or greater in diameter. Clearly this tree meets that standard, so it is a heritage oak, and that merits the highest level of protection under our code. Any modifications to it that would be significant other than minor pruning would have to go through a permit process that would include city council. So there's a couple images I shared with the commission in the written report, and here are those older images. Trying to find older images, as in like pre-1955, was a bit difficult. We had plenty of opportunities to encounter photos of other oak trees, but we never seemed to be able to find much in this one. The photo at the left is around 1990. Would be about when those buildings were fairly new. I know they were developed, I think, early 80s, so they were still in their first decade. And you can see it was a substantial sized tree then. The 1955 photo, it's one of the more dominant trees in that overall landscape. And next slide. In general, and this is a Quercus, what's known as a Quercus lobata, the two prominent large oaks that you'll encounter in this part of California and throughout really most of California are the valley oaks, which is this particular species, and also live oaks, which is Quercus agrifolia. And the live oaks basically are non-deciduous. These have a larger leaf with rounder profiles, shapes, if you will, and they're deciduous. So there are large trees, obviously, on a regular basis when they grow to maturity. According to reports by the Department of Agriculture, what you can expect to find for mature trees would range in heights from 30 to 75 feet, trunk diameters ranging from just under 2 feet to almost 2.5 feet. But of course, that's sort of a normal range. And on occasion, you will have individual trees that will be much larger. This is one example. The largest recorded, at least at the time of the Department of Agriculture report that I referenced, which was in the mid-90s, as I recall, at that time was the tallest was 138 feet, and the largest in terms of trunk diameter was something like 9 feet. This tree, by our estimate, the oak tree, I'll note right now, the oak tree report that a consultant did for us a couple years ago indicated an approximate height of about 50 feet, but I did my own measurement just a few weeks ago, and I'm estimating it's really closer to 60 at this point, and it has had a couple of years of good weather and growth, so we're not in that much disagreement when you consider that, and not of course withstanding neither one of us got a tall enough ladder to actually measure it. It has a girth of 66 inches. And I measured the area of coverage for the canopy at almost exactly 6,000 feet, which is heck, most of the homes I've owned are roughly a third that size. So it gives you an idea of how much coverage it has. And if any of you have not actually just walked around underneath it, you should, because it just blows your mind. Mm-hmm. Okay. Checking with our sources and looking at the measurements and data we have, we're estimating it to be about 200 years old. My guess is it's at least 200, but probably not more than 250. But the experts basically would say about 200. When you think about that, the president at the time was James Monroe. I did not know that president. Only 23 of the nation's 50 states had actually been accepted in the Union at that time. Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, my home state went into the nation at 1821, something like that, so it just barely beat the tree, or just about the same time. Indigenous tribal populations still inhabited much of the western territories, and of course locally that was be the Chumash, and they were basically the predominant residents you would have encountered at that time that the tree sprouted. Juan Bautista de Anza passed through the area several decades earlier, about 1776, I believe, and work at that time was concluding on the Spanish missions, the chain that was periodically going through its construction phase over several decades, or almost 100 years, I believe. But that was coming to its conclusion at that time. And then the adobe, some 25 years later, was constructed across the street. So the tree was already well established and was still in its younger years when the Masson House was built. 80 years old, more or less. So it gives you an idea of how long it's been in the local landscape. So the question is, what do we do with it? This body, as the Old Town Coalition, really, and not the Historic Preservation Commission, but you really kind of wear both hats at the same time sometimes, and this would probably be one of those examples, because this all relates to history. It's perfectly reasonable, appropriate for this body to discuss it and consider ways to monument it. It always seems funny to me to think you'd put a monument in something that in and of itself seems to be a giant monument, but the idea would be, if I'm remembering Commissioner Human in particular, or Vice Chair Human, excuse me, the idea is to use the opportunity to portray, explain, inform persons about more than just the tree itself, but what it really represents as something that's been there over a period of time and what it's witnessed per se, including the fact that it precedes basically the European Anglo migration and establishment into this part of the world. So this is a discussion item. The idea here is we'll take notes. We'll add what other information and ideas come from this group to what we've been conjuring up and shared with you, and then I'll run it up the proverbial chain and see where it lands. The other thing, of course, would be if this is gaining traction in the city, not just with the commission, but with city leadership elsewhere, we would next contact the property owner, Leonis Adobe Association, and talk about their take on some of the ideas and try to get something going. Okay, so that's the end of my spiel.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. I just want to make, I neglected to introduce, well, Tom Bartlett. He's our glue here. And Tom's a great guy. He's taught me a lot that I didn't know before. And Savina Joel. She's our new city planner.
Assistant City Planner.
Assistant city planner. She's new to the commission here. Welcome. Okay, nice to have you. Okay, let's talk about this. Anybody have a? Michael, go ahead.
Okay. Let me share a vision. And it starts with going down a couple hours ago, walking around the tree again, and also looking at the second oak tree that was mentioned in the reports, which is the other kind of oak tree. It's the live oak. So we've got both kinds of oak trees there. And then what I did is I went out to Calabasas Road, where there's the newly installed sidewalk, with the historic theme. And what's interesting is that there's a wonderful indentation of about 6 feet where the sidewalk gets wider, right directly in front of the oak tree. That you can stand there, look at the huge valley oak. And so here's the vision that I would paint to see if it possibly gets any traction. We could put up 3 placards sort of in a row right there. There's space for it. And it's in a position that may be public property, it may be Leonis Adobe property, but it's the sidewalk. And so many people walk by that sidewalk, especially Saturdays going to farmers market, coming and going. And my sort of vision of these 3 placards would be one that says the people who used to live on this land are the Chumash and the Tongva, and have perhaps a little text, and and the placard could be like those we see out at Malibu Creek State Park and other parks, where you maybe have some image in the placard too that brings it alive. And the second placard could say, and right in front of you, looming over you, is this great example of a very historic, wonderful valley oak, and then it could describe some of what the valley oak is, and perhaps that it's one of the 2 very major oaks that thrive in Calabasas. Then the third placard could say, and if you look a little bit to your right, and just 50 feet from you, is the other kind of oak that we find in Calabasas. And interestingly, I'll tell you something really funny. My the person who gives me haircuts works there, and as I was out looking at the oak, she came out and said, "Michael, what are you doing here?" And so I told her about the oaks, and she said, "I didn't know about valley oaks. I didn't know about live oaks." And so I think we have a lot of people who walk down that sidewalk who don't know anything about what they're seeing. So this is sort of my, and by the way, the second placard, which I would think would be in the center, describing the Valley Oak, could have, you know, an image of the tree, and you kind of look at that on the placard, then you look up, and there's the tree. So obviously, ideas like this can be taken, run with, turned into other things, but at least this is the vision that I had today as I stood there and looked at that incredible oak, and then the second oak.
That's beautiful. So are you for or against the pruning?
I'm sorry, pardon me?
Are you for or against pruning it as recommended?
I'm actually for the pruning because it seemed to be recommended in a cautious sense. And the other thing of which I'm aware is that these really, really, really huge valley oaks, they ultimately someday collapse of their own weight. And if the pruning relieves some of that weight, that tree might be with us decades longer. And as an example of that, there was another great oak over in the shopping center right on Valley Circle and further down Calabasas Road, and not too many months ago, it collapsed. And others within the Mallwood neighborhood, the area, we've lost several others in the last 30 years. So am I for the pruning? Yes, for that reason.
Just to point out, I mean, we could all express support for pruning when it's needed, but that's not a matter before this commission right now. It's on private property. They would make the decision whether they want to prune it. The report was actually done 2 years ago in response to a request to prune it, and I believe that may have actually had some of it done, although I observed there was still deadwood in it, or maybe new deadwood. You could probably use some minor pruning again now, but that's up to the property owner.
So, I certainly support this as well. Malibu Creek State Park, I'm a docent there. We have the placards you're talking about. We're actually doing one for Native Americans as we speak. We're building one. You know, this would be certainly awesome to show their uses of the acorns as like sustenance and kind of tie that in together, you know, with what the Chumash and the Tonga did here. And their lives here, so I could see that would be awesome on a placard. I will say that you look at kind of King Gillette Ranch and some of the huge oak trees there, they have supports that are kind of tied to the main branch, and you know, I think we may want to consider that from a historical perspective. We don't want to lose the tree, so is there a way we could ask that something like that be done?
The tree does already have a number of supports within it. If you look carefully, there are cable supports between and among the branches so that it's been stabilized in the past. Again, I mean, actual maintenance of this is up to the property owner, but these are things that we would at least discuss with them in our conversations with them after we, you know, have a collection of ideas and want to share them with the owner.
Maybe an arborist can take a look at it. So.
Right, the report that was attached from 2001 was from an arborist, and it would be, again, something like that in the near future when any action would want to be taken. They'd have to do a report again.
Right.
So Michael, would you also envision kind of estimating the age on one of these plaques? So.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Probably both of the trees. And also another thought, when we consider who the owner is, the Leonis Association, I would hope it would be sort of a friendly owner in terms of working with this concept. And it is interesting that the tree has been taken care of with the supports that are up there that were mentioned in the report. So I think we're lucky to have the tree with an owner who seems to appreciate it, and we would expect to appreciate it and work with us.
Yeah, right.
I think that's totally reasonable, and we expect the same here at staff. I'm just trying to, at least on the front end, be as respectful and understanding as possible that it is private property no matter who that is, and at least putting that on the record. But for example, with who they often refer to as Mayor Emeritus, which is Dennis Washburn, multiple mayor and longtime council member and co-founder of the city. I know he at least was on the foundation board for a number of years. He may still be on it. So my first phone call will actually be to Dennis.
Mhm.
I just want to thank Vice Chair Human for putting in the legwork and teaching us a bit about that.
Thank
That's very cool.
Very nice.
One more question. So if we went with the 3-plaque idea, or somebody did, who would kind of draw those up and kind of put the wording together?
Well, thank you. I think that is very important, and you would appreciate that too, that it has to be drafted carefully, and you have to involve the right people. You would run into that also over at the park. And especially when if you have a placard that lays out some of the history of the Chumash and Tongva people, you would actually want to consult with some people within their communities to run the text by them. If one naively misses that step, you could end up trying to do something very good and end up in a controversy. And so it's easy to do, but I think it has to be done, carefully. And so we'd have to figure out, in a sense, who would be the primary author of a draft of what those placards might say. And then obviously it goes through, a team process and the city process to arrive at what the text would be. When I say that, that obviously has happened with, I also stopped by and looked at the 3 placards that are on the bird path. And, 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom. And they came out of this commission's work. And so there's obviously a process that predates my being here of how we arrived at the text, how we researched it and arrived at the text. So I think we just follow normal procedure that way, but with some care about consulting with the living representatives today of those native communities.
I wonder if Michael might be a good person to do a first draft of
Yeah,
what might be on the
I
plaque,
think so.
if he'd be willing.
I'd be pleased to do it, and I will say this, when I do drafts like this, I do not do them with pride of authorship, so I'd be happy to do a first draft and let it go where it goes.
Sounds good.
I'll just add a couple of things. Thank you for pointing out the plaques that we already did some years ago and installed and were able to maintain in most of the places that didn't get removed, such as the one on Old Topanga. But if you'll remember, as we went through that, we had a lot of good language to work with, but you end up being limited by production parameters and trying to have a font size people can actually read. And so I think what we'll go through is a pretty serious editing process. So the idea would be to start with a good bunch of information, and then you're going to have to winnow it down to the most salient facts and in the most crisp language possible, and then you end up with what you can use. And by all means, Vice Chair Human, if you want to take a crack at something, go for it and send it to me when you're ready, and we'll collaborate. Obviously, we're here to do the heavy lifting.
Well, good, let's collaborate, and also on costs, maybe we can get some help from your being a docent. We can, we have to figure out what the costs are. My sense is it should be, the optimum size would be, it wouldn't be overwhelming, but it wouldn't be as small as the placards on the bird streets. But there are costs. We have to look at the city budget, and it might be that we could raise some private funds in support of that. I don't know whether the city would work that way or welcome that, but there might be even I can imagine some ways you might get the community to buy into the project in 2 meanings of that word. One is contributions, and the other is feeling ownership with what is put up there.
The Historical Society might be a worthy partner in such an effort. I think that might come as a second phase after we more fully cook the vision as you described it on the outset. And that would be something that once we have a more crystallized version where, for example, we can go to the sidewalk area and do some measuring, consult with Public Works, and have a better feel for what's truly possible there. And then we can have some language to chew on that will be, and then we take that information, look into what costs might be, and then we can come back to this commission at your next meeting and have a detailed report on where all that stands. The budget for fiscal year 23-24 to the next year, and then inclusive of a 5-year capital improvement program, is going to our council over the next about 6 weeks, initially for discussion, some revisions, and then final adoption before the end of the current fiscal year. Fiscal year being July 1 through June 30. So anything that would be desired, which I can guarantee you right now is not in the draft budget and won't be in the final budget because it didn't start in the draft, we'd have to go to council and just ask for, assuming this carries on and we have support moving into the council, we'd have to ask for an appropriation.
I think realistically, I'd be very surprised if it were done in a matter of months. I could imagine it might flow over into the next budget year anyway, but
Oh, it
we'll
would.
see.
Yeah. But that, I don't see that as an obstacle. I'm just letting you know that in terms of working with a budget, there's really nothing to work for in terms of the city budget. It's not a part of it yet. But to know what it would likely cost once we have it a little more crystallized would be good information for everybody to know here. And then I'd be able to take that more detailed information to the city manager, and we could figure out whether this is something that we want to carry on to council and ask for an appropriation, recognizing that there may be ideas for getting funding from other sources as well. Great.
And if it's helpful, Tom, I can share the vendor who does ours at the Malibu Creek State Park, and I think they were in the ballpark of about 5,000
Okay.
per placard. So
And I'd like to know which particular placards you're talking about.
So we have
You could
one-
I'd like to see it myself.
yeah, I'll send you the locations.
Anybody have anything else?
Well, maybe just one thing. So what we do at Malibu Creek is probably like 3 by 2 feet. So each one is about that big.
Yeah.
So think about like that size. And, you know, like you were saying, it has pictures and then describes something. So it would have a picture of what a typical valley oak looks like, an acorn, and describing kind of how its use potentially. It would be something like that. And it's kind of laminated on the top. So the picture is kind of below it and then laminated. And those are quite large. And 3, you might want to take a look and get or I can get the exact measurements on it, if that will be helpful to see if that's what's feasible. But it might also come with, city examining the site and seeing what's feasible. So, but I'll send it over. I'll send it over to Tom.
Okay. Anybody have anything else? We good? Okay, the second item of new business, discussion on potential survey of eligible historic properties.
Okay. So this is another somewhat repeat item and something certainly has been on commission members' minds because we've talked about it before, and you asked that we come back to you with some more specific information about what we could do. So to give a little bit of context, the original survey of properties in the city that led to determinations of which properties to pursue for local designations as local landmarks started off with 187 properties being surveyed in the city. The parameters that led to that was it was a focus on structures dating from 1964 or earlier, and the reason that date is, or that year is the one that's specified, is the protocol is to look at properties that are 45 years old or older, so that in a belt and suspenders kind of way, you're making sure you include for sure anything that's 50 years old. If somebody didn't do the accounting right or whatever it is, you almost for sure have everything that's 50 years old or older, and that's sort of a benchmark year in the National Preservation Act. Okay, so that was the date for what older properties or buildings should be looked at. Subdivisions from 1960 and more recent, at that time anyway, were deemed not worthy of investigating because the general understanding in the preservation community nationwide was you didn't have historic resources in terms of the built environment, even though some of those subdivisions were older than 45 years, okay? They were a dime a dozen, if you will. They were everywhere, they looked the same, yada, yada, right? So, for context, I bring that up. Out of that survey, of course, the Masson House was the one that was deemed eligible not only for potential local listing, but even potentially for state and national. And then 20 other properties or structures were deemed potentially eligible for listing. And we all know that several of those are since listed. You know, they went through this process. They had a designation determined by this body and then ultimately approved by City Council. Then 95 properties or structures were determined to be worthy of resurveying in the future. Now, the initial thought that we had as staff when we contacted the consultant, we contacted the same consultant who did that work in 2009, and they're still doing this kind of work. We wanted to go to them and say, hey, we've got these, of course, properties that were surveyed before, most of which have not been designated as any local landmark yet, for whatever reason. And we also have 95 properties that in your prior survey you said they're worthy of resurveying. Well, we think after this much time we should resurvey. Do you agree? Well, right off the bat they said yes. I mean, 14, 15 years, you know, that's enough passage of time to resurvey. For sure, what you're describing to us should be resurveyed. Plus, what you really should do is they suggest that we should open up the parameters the way we did the first time, that you're going to look at properties 45 years older citywide and subdivisions that previously would have been excluded are no longer. They actually have changed that protocol, and ideally then you would include the subdivision tracts that were developed between 1960 and 1978, but not more recently than 1978. The rationale there, and it came out of, I think, a railroad situation or a highway situation that would affect one of these tracks, or Caltrans, in fact. And the rationale is that you had development styles, as it were, and architectural repetition, that sort of thing, that in some cases, with certain things, are worthy of at least consideration for some manner of preservation because they reflect that time, that era, and those occurrences, a key part of this nation's growth and maturation and change from that era. So I think I've got another image here. What I'd like to point out with this is on the left-hand side is a subdivision from that era, post-World War II. I don't know the year this was done. I couldn't even tell you what city it was in. But that's one indication of what we're talking about. A lot of what you see in terms of more traditional suburban development, its first phase, as it were, because zoning took flight in the 1920s in this country. And so post-World War I and pre-World War II, there was a lot of tract development and subdivision under the zoning and subdivision ordinance of that era. But once you had post-World War II, where you truly had autocentric subdividing going on, it took a little bit different form. And the cul-de-sac was largely an unknown thing before World War II, for example, okay? So there are some things like that. You had master plan communities. We have one right here. Let's see, did I manage to get that photo in there? There we go. So here is Calabasas Lake and Park Calabasas. Mm-hmm. In the 1970s, when it was basically under construction, they'd finished the lake. If you look, sorry, I'm going to borrow a microphone too. If you look right here, this right here is Calabasas Inn, which since has been, it closed, and the Avanti is located right here now. This is the tennis and swim center, So you've got the lake here, I forget the name right now, but the condos on this side weren't even built yet. And here it looks like Lockheed's under construction, what was originally Lockheed. So you get a real good idea of how this was just first taking shape. And this is in the 1970s. Well, there are actually segments of sidewalk when you walk in this area, there you'll find that the contractor has their stamp in it, and it's from like 1968, 1969. And I've seen photos from that era for the lake area, this part also. So this is an example locally of a track from that era. And it's a master planned community. So this would be one of the things that would be examined in that kind of resurvey effort. They would look not only at individual structures and properties, they'd look at the potential value of certain tracts in the city as subdivision tracts. So we're talking about potentially a much bigger elephant to chew on here than what staff originally had in mind. Now, it's not to say that that's the only way we could go, because we could always trim it back to what we had in mind in the first place and save money and just focus on those properties. But I do think it's worthwhile to share with this commission what we learned from the consultant. And there is a little tidbit I want to get back to on 2 slides back, that one. I'll get to it in a minute. It's about the lower right-hand photo. So we wanted all the commission to be aware of this so that we could at least have a little more dialogue on where you'd like to go. I think the way to go is to try to do the whole enchilada. And actually, we're going to have to go on to the end. I'll come back to that. So to give you monetary context, the original survey in 2009 was about a $41,000 effort. Now, that included doing a historic context, which is sort of a broad brush of the whole city and the city surrounds, landscape, that sort of thing. Obviously, we don't need to redo that. So, and just by sheer coincidence, as written up in the Acorn, I think last week, City of Agora Hills is now embarking on writing their own historic preservation ordinance, preparing their own historic context, and creating a process for designating landmarks. They're going to explore, I don't know how they'll do it. They may have their council serve as the Historic Preservation Commission, who knows. But they're going to explore how to do that, how they want to do it, to suit their population. And they're doing a very limited survey that they've already kind of determined what their focus is. I talked to their principal planner, so I get a little more information on this than just what was in the article. So theirs is really focused. So if you saw their article, you saw, well, that was only $7,000. Well, that's because it's already zoomed in on a handful of properties, and to get those documented, they're doing at least what was called a windshield survey, a larger group. But that's not a bona fide survey, which you can't do just from a windshield, just driving by. So we're talking about a much more in-depth effort than that, involving a far greater number of properties, to include some subdivisions which would be considered as potential historic district eligibility examples. So we're talking a much more involved thing. It would be more expensive than $7,000. In fact, I would argue it's probably going to be more expensive than $41,000. Factoring in interest rates alone, I come to that conclusion. So if we go back 3 slides, this is my favorite one. So that lower right-hand photo by Coinkadink is from my home state, Indiana. And I knew about these because I've seen them in Indiana. And they've been in some other places, but that's a steel house from post-World War II era. There was at least one manufacturer, and they have these steel panels, and if you look carefully, they're basically square, and it was truly innovative, and it didn't take off very big. It's not like you saw more and more of them. I'm guessing none of you have seen one of these, but the ones that they did sure have stood the test of time, and they're basically worthy of designation, whereas maybe 20 years ago that wouldn't have been the case. So there's a particular example, this one, and I forget which town it is actually a locally listed landmark. So there's an example.
Tom, I have a question. If you took a tract or subdivision and made it historical, how would that limit the homeowners from changing their property improvements?
That's a great question. If you look at the historic preservation ordinance, or that section of our municipal code, it has a section specific and to a pretty good level of detail about historic districts, how we would go about creating them if we were to consider them, and what limitations that would mean for property owners. The only way that I can foresee pursuing a district for any part of this city is with an awful lot of outreach, because you want to make sure you've got community support. Now, to say you're going to try to get 100% of all property owners in a certain area to agree, unlikely, but you'd want to get a super majority, I would think. It does put limitations on it. Not too unlike a individually listed property. If your individually owned building or buildings were deemed in their own right to be having the integrity and being a contributing resource to the district.
So you
There
have to
would be in any given district, of course, non-contributing resources. A home that got inserted on an infill lot 10 years ago would be non-contributing automatically, right? So those, you're not going to have nearly the level of limitations to them. There might be limitations from a kind of zoning standpoint in terms of setbacks and whether to, how much of a facade can totally address the street, something to try to keep the character of the district but not interfere with the architecture or the size of the building overall, things like that. But an individually contributing resource, there could be, basically it would be the same level of restrictions that apply to the designated landmarks we have now.
So Tom, so it was 41,000 for the last survey, and this one's a lot bigger, larger scale, but then it doesn't have the other historical kind of texture about it. So I guess my question is, if we go down this path and it's 40 or 60K, does that take away from, our other things we're considering, and then how do we kind of marry that with what we actually want to do as or recommend?
That's getting to the dollars. I was presenting the dollar side of it just more as information. The commissions in the city here have no budgetary authority. So we could talk about costs for our own, I can't use the word enjoyment, but for information and understanding, but not truly a matter of consideration, other than if you all as a group just think something's so egregiously expensive it's not worth pursuing. But let's just say you're both, for both items we've talked about tonight, this group agrees we need to move forward on it. Now in the case, they need to be a little more fully baked, and we'd come back to you and say, okay, this is what we're talking about doing. We're talking about a survey that, because I'd want to get Teresa Grimes and or maybe another firm as well to give us a proposal. And then we'd know, exactly what we'd get for how many dollars. And I'd want to run it by this group and say, okay, is this what you'd like to see? Well, okay, great. Let's say it's going to come in at 60 grand. Well, now I have something to take to the city manager and the council, and it's their decision whether they would make an appropriation and amend the budget, right? And the same thing for the other item. And I don't think we need to look at it as, well, would we have to decide on one versus the other? No, the city council would have to decide whether it's one or the other, or neither one, or both of them.
So then, not considering the fiscal impact, I guess big picture, is this slice of Americana something we want to preserve? I have a couple thoughts on this. You're very historically adept, and you know what you're talking about here. These are auto-centric tracks. This was the American Auto Lobby really contributing to this model of design. The other thing you brought up was the metal panels on the home. We don't see them because that's the exception. not the rule. Post-war structures are notoriously of less quality than pre-war structures. So do we, as a commission, want to A, spend the money on this to inquire and to do a survey, and then B, I mean, I don't know what would go into preserving first the structures, what kind of money would go into it, but again, understanding that I don't know of any Calabasas homes that are of these metal panels. So I'm sort of just pulling away from this idea in general. Again, you know, we're moving away from an auto-centric society, not just locally, but I mean, globally, I guess I can say. So big picture, I'm not really moved by this. Again, the slice of Americana worth preserving is not in this, if you ask me.
I have a few comments.
Just, if you don't mind, I'd like to
Sure.
sort of answer something here. When I discuss what I've discussed here, it's not because I conjured it up or I have an opinion about it. It's protocol under the California Environmental Quality Act that actually requires us to look at that kind of stuff now as part of environmental review when you've got projects that become subject to CEQA. Now, in the case of doing a survey for purposes of historic preservation, they like to follow the same protocol. So I've simply explained to you what the protocol is as of today. So if we were going to do a if we were going to do one, this is what we'd have to survey. And a survey is just finding out what's there. And knowing what's there, then you know factually, well, are any of these of that unique steel panel type? Well, I can tell you right now, none of them are. That's a really rare thing. It was more prevalent out east. I don't know that it ever saw the light of day out here. But, I mean, I agree personally with that, but the fact of the matter is, when you do these things, you want to gather the evidence, gather the facts, and then exactly have the kind of conversation you're talking about on what really you feel is meritorious.
So Tom, we have done a survey in the past, and I think it was pretty extensive. So just an alternative might be to survey the new group of properties that it might have fallen into that historical, 45 plus years, rather than doing a full blown, just an idea.
No, I think it's a great idea. We'll take a note of that, and when we have our follow-up conversation with Ms. Grimes, we'll bring that up.
Yeah, the whole concept of this survey really provoked three different kinds of thoughts on my part. The first is, if the survey cost $41,000 14 years ago, and we're talking about a much larger scope now, I think we're going to get sticker shock if we, and when I say we, I understand the city council, but in terms of anything we would say that might result in advice to the city council, I can see this becoming way, way too expensive for the city. And so my reaction to it is to really almost pare it down into what should be studied, what really merits study, some type of very preliminary look at everything and say, what do we really think might become part of a historic property or historic district? But in that focus, it took me in some other directions. One of them is, I saw this reference to 20 structures determined to be potentially eligible. So those 20 structures I'd be interested in. First of all, do all 20 still exist today, 14 years later? Mm-hmm. Have we lost any? And if we have, do we have to be worried about losing historic structures? And if we haven't, that's great news. But then those 20 structures, because they are 14 years older and they may deserve some particular attention about, are some of them actually worth a real focus? And then I noted the other 95 structures which were determined to be worthy of resurveying in the future. Well, it's sort of like, what are they? And part of it is, it's hard to react to this without almost seeing the list of the 20 and the 95. And I think of, my own home was built in 1968. I've never thought of it as a historic structure, probably because I was born 19 years before it was built, and maybe I'm a historic structure. But in any event, I think, and then I also thought of this, that if we were to do a new survey, even if it's pared down, it's probably going to cost more than 41,000, and there's maybe a trade-off in terms of, do we find the resources to fix up the Masson House or get a new survey? You know, which is more urgent, which is more crucial? Is it worth waiting 5 years on another survey? And then that got me thinking, and then I'll soon be done, about the Masson House and that property, and I've walked it many times over really 30 years. The house is there, but it's not all that's there. If you walk behind it a little ways, you find a wonderful old fireplace, rock fireplace, some good number of feet tall. It was like a master fireplace with petrified wood and minerals built into it, the way that you see sometimes in, 120-year-old, 140-year-old fireplaces. And so there was a house there that probably burned down or is gone, but it made me think of sort of ghost towns, how people actually are interested in a ghost town where you find less left than even that old fireplace sometimes. And so what it made me think of is in the Masson House, with the story that we might tell inside, if there were like a place to tell a story, you could tell the story of more the other, what one once was there in Headwaters. What is that fireplace over there? Is that itself worthy of historic preservation? And then as you walk around that whole property, you find other foundations and walls that obviously were parts of structures from, 60, 80, 100, 140 years ago. And one time I walked up on the other side of the road, up Wagon Wheel Road, and there is a well there that, it worried me at the time, and I first saw it over 30 years ago because it was open, and you could fall 8 or 10 feet into it. And if any person or child fell into it, we'd probably never find them, at least for a long time. But still, that reflects something that was there before. And the last thing I'll say about that area is there's a lot of work going on the road right up there now. They're putting in sidewalks there. We're going to be able to walk up to where, the park is, the Walnut Park. And so that whole area, perhaps it is the time to really, let's say, focus more on money going there than into a survey.
I was going to bring up the Masson House part of my comments at the end of the meeting, and so I can lend to that discussion in a little bit.
Anybody else? We good? All right.
I
let's-
appreciate the input very much. We've
Yeah.
made notes. We're going to, like I said, get back with at least one of the consultants. I know well the people that were retained by Gore Hills for the work they're doing, and I'm going to reach out to them as well.
Tom, one thing I just forgot and remembered right now, you at one point said there were potential for graduate students who might take on such a project. Is that at all feasible at this point, or not really?
For the survey work, not of the type we're talking about. Now, if I could find a particular graduate student who's specializing in historic preservation, and I know some universities have very strong programs in that regard and can have some really talented people, but they're hard to nail down to do some work as part of either their academic, credits or for money. I'd still be hiring somebody, so. But we've looked at it a couple times. I could beat those bushes again, but I think really we're now looking at a scope that probably is beyond that.
Good idea. Okay, moving on, resolution number 2023-013, setting the regular meeting dates for the commission.
Can we fast track this for move to approve, or?
You can just, There's no presentation, but Savina was going to introduce the item and lead
Please
you
do.
through the approval unless you've read it all and just want to move on it.
Well,
You
I
can
think
tell
for the
me.
public, we have to review it, so sorry to jump the
Yeah.
gun. Thank you, Savina.
I don't have a PowerPoint or anything, I'm just gonna speak to a little bit. Okay. So item number 4 is the adoption of resolution number 2023-013 for setting the regular meeting dates and times for the commission to be on the third Wednesday of the month in January, April, July, and October at 6 p.m. So for a bit of background, setting a regular meeting time has historically, no pun intended, been kind of an issue for the commission. So currently the Calabasas Municipal Code sets the meeting time to be the second Wednesday of January, April, July, and October. But this comes into conflict with city council meetings, which also occur on that second Wednesday. So HPC meetings have frequently been held on the first Wednesday of the month. However, that in turn coincides with many major holidays. And so staff is proposing resolution number 2023-013 to set the regular meeting times to be the third Wednesday of the month in January, April, July, and October at 6 p.m. And the staff recommendation is to adopt the resolution.
Okay,
I would like to move to approve
okay,
this
anybody,
resolution.
second?
I'll second.
Okay, let's have a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
No
I do have a
opposed.
question, though.
Okay,
And I guess it goes back to the training we did. You know, I don't think we can do Zoom anymore, right? So, and you can't, if you were to kind of call in, you'd have to disclose your location. Can you?
Yes, I
confirm that?
mean, the way Zoom participation by members of the commission and the council for that matter is to occur now is only in basically a special circumstance / emergency where clearly that member cannot be there. Health reasons, for example, could be something where somebody's limited on mobility, but otherwise considered a desk just fine. Might want to take advantage of this, but it's limited to 2 occasions a year. It has to be requested that permission in writing and well enough advance that the arrangements can be made. And under law, anytime a member of a public body is serving in some capacity as part of the group from a remote location, so it's a notified meeting of the group or the commission or council, that person has to have divulged, and as part of the notice has to disclose that location, and that location has to be available to the general public as well.
sure. Okay, all right, well, hearing 5-0 to pass the resolution, it's passed.
Thank you. We do have, Mr. Chair, a original copy here for signature when we're all finished.
Okay,
I'm going to tackle you if you try to get out the door.
all right, I'll watch for that. Okay, moving on, future agenda items, reports from the Historic Preservation Officer.
Okay. Future agenda item-wise, I think we've probably touched on what those would be in the nature of what we're already going to chew on and spit back out in a better form and more refined and bring back to you at your next meeting, which will be what time? What day?
July 5th, 2023 at 6 p.m.
If anybody knows, she knows, because she wrote it.
I'll tell-
Okay, so that's when the next meeting will be. That's what
Exactly.
you'll want to adjourn to, but I see us coming back on those items there that we've already discussed as well. And if we come up with something else that's possible, as always, we'd have something in Old Town that needs a review and approval, a sign, what have you. We've had some things going on, a lot of back and forth that centers around some code enforcement action on a property over there. And if that, in the efforts to remedy the code enforcement, includes some revisions to the building, well, we're going to be before this commission with those. So if that matures to that or something else comes up, we may have an agenda item that relates to a certificate of appropriateness.
I would love to go back and re-review something that we looked at in the past on April 6, 2022. It included a list of eligible properties. There were 16 listed here, and then there's a couple other extra ones. But it seems like it would be really a good outcome for us to narrow this list down to some that really might actually become on our list of properties that we want to say are historic here in Calabasas. You know, the pump house is one. I'm looking at it. You know, we talked about the National Velvet. There's a lot of money that needs to be spent there to get that back up to speed. But I think maybe that's something we can talk about, different ways to try to fund that. There's a cattle crossing on Dry Canyon Cold Creek Road that might be also another one that might not be too difficult, maybe to decide how old it is. That might be hard. But I would love to focus down on a few of the properties that we've already talked about and see if we can actually add something to the list.
Okay, adding to the list I see on multiple levels. One is, one way or another, right, if we do a super focused effort, which is to take the 16 or so that we brought to this group a year ago, or we do the 20, which actually I think is the exact same 16 minus a couple that we've designated since then, or we do the 95 plus 20. There was, you know, one other option that Vice Chair Human discussed, or some hybrid between those two, where in addition to the 16 or 20, we add the cattle crossing, for example, which wasn't even on the list because I'm not sure they knew it was there at the time. It just drove over it, because you drive through there, you don't even know it's there. So we would add some things like that, and the idea I have is I'll take everything from the 16 to 20 properties to the whole enchilada to our consultant or consultants and ask them to tell me what their sharpest pencil will give us on cost, if you will, or at least an estimated cost. And then with that information, I could say, well, okay, now that we're considering minimalistic to middle-ish to the whole thing, what is that range on cost? And what's it going to yield? Well, for the 16 or 20, it's going to give us the same result. They're still going to get surveyed at the same level of detail no matter what the overall project scope is. It's just a matter of how much else do you want to learn and document. Because that's really what the survey does. It gives you the information to start making decisions like this on an informed scale of potentially a citywide scale, which is what we started with, 14, 15 years ago.
You know, first of all, I really like that idea of bringing back those 15 or 16 or whatever it was, and looking again, and seeing what happened, and identifying the rest of the 20 and saying they're already addressed. You know, maybe it's the bird bath, for example. But the other thing I would like to do with the 95 or whatever is have you at the staff level, Tom, look at whether any 10 or less, maybe even 5 or less of them really command attention. Because my sense is that if we looked at all 95, we might identify a few that should be moved up to the list of 16 or something, but after that we would never get to them. And so if you saw a few others that maybe deserve attention, I'd like to hear that from you.
Okay, and where do you live again? I'm going to make sure that's on the list.
Thank you.
No, I'm kidding. I think that's great. It falls into the middle category. So we can look at a middle small that would basically be what you're talking about. We can look at a middle that's closer to the 95, if not all 95, and then what's everything. As far as the middle plus, I mean, if there's something that's not even on that list, that as we look at it from staff standpoint, we think it at least falls in the 45-year older parameters and those sorts of things, I'm going to throw those out as a must item also. But we'll have to wait and see as I really look around. Okay. So yeah, we can report back on the already previously surveyed stuff sort of on its own, but recognizing, which is kind of what I was getting at, it's sort of a part of the other item.
And can we also maybe go back and I'm not sure what was done with the Masson House, maybe nothing to
Well,
compare.
that was on my list.
Yeah, okay. it's on the list,
I
good.
can update you all now if you'd like. Okay.
Sure.
I've not been able to do any work since the report I gave you last time. There's no updates to that exact effort. All of that information I've presented to the city manager and his assistant, and that information has been shared, I believe, through them to the Headwaters Corner Board, so that they have information on the Masson House. The Masson House obviously is on the property that is managed by and is part of Headwaters Corner. So that board is sort of the oversight body, and Tree People is the our partners in the efforts at Headwaters Corner. They have a stewardship and a stake in that property as well. So because negotiations are underway on the bigger effort of what to do with and how to do it best for Headwaters Corner, because remember, one of the other 20 or 16 landmarks was on that property. It was I forget the name now, it's been on the tip of my tongue this whole time, but it burned down. Right, there was another building that was
Bartell House.
closed, the Bartell House, thank you. The Bartell House burned down. The fireplace that you mentioned is one that from what I understand, was part of the larger landscape grounds that went with the Bartell House. So it's dates from like the 1920s, the time when the Bartell House was built. And there are walls and little seat walls and a bunch of other steps and other things that were all part of that large landscaped area that was part of the Bartell House property. So the Headwaters Corner owns and is going to redo all of that. And they're working out conceptual plans. They're trying to figure out budget for that. And they're needing to figure out the Masson House role and position in that. So with the information that they now have from what we've prepared, they're now going to try to figure that out. And then what we can do in the Masson House and how to pursue funding is going to have to come on the back end of their decision. So I'm in a holding pattern is really what it comes down to on the Bartell. We're just going to continue to maintain it and keep it in as good, good shape the way it is now without rehabbing it until that outcome comes through, and then we'll bring this back to the front burner as part of that larger effort and start investigating how to fund it. And the programming ends up having to be asked and answered in part through what the Headwaters Corner effort's doing.
By the way, something I found interesting about that whole property is you have Headwaters Creek there, which comes right along pretty much, but close to the road. And then it goes underground into a culvert built for maybe a couple blocks. And then right opposite Rencrest, on the other side of Valmar, it comes out of the culvert and it flows straight along Valmar for quite a ways. That is not its original course. It used to meander around, and it was obviously redirected, as part of the development. And it actually came with, even maybe 2 blocks towards, in another direction, and ran right by the backyard of my home. But the backyard of my home is now, sort of a block and a half from where the stream runs. So there was a lot of interesting landscaping work done when the developments occurred.
Yeah, that part of the bird tracks that's just barely east of Valmar, part of that was where the original creek at least bent in and around. So where Valmar is, to build it, they filled it in, channelized the stream to the west. So in really wet weather, that area, that part of the what we call the bird tracks, gets very soggy, and that's because that was where the creek used to be. So it's still a fairly low elevation relative to everything else around there, and still part of that little micro aquifer, as it will. it gets saturated along with the creek, because that's where the creek was.
Interesting. Wow. Okay, anybody have anything else?
I don't have anything else in terms of my report. That completed it. Oh, and did I tell you about the banners? That was the other thing I was gonna mention. The Old Town banners.
Yeah.
The designs that we reviewed have been, everybody's approved in terms of staff level. They're just having to finalize one of the holiday banners. I think it's the 4th of July that they're still debating on one type or another.
Yeah.
In terms of like the flag style, they're gonna use the same boundary and stuff. So they'll all be kind of consistent, but they'll be able to change them out for when it's a holiday, 4th of July, and they're also gonna change them out for Pumpkin Festival. But the rest of the time, we're gonna have one banner that's showing the Kramer store, and the other one showing the Leonis Adobe structures, including, I think, the windmill. I think maybe that was it, or the water tower. But they're the ones that this group gave a thumbs up to, and they should be getting council review and approval, I think, either the next meeting or the meeting after that. So that means in short order, you should see them up, and I'm thinking they're wanting to get them up before next Pumpkin Festival, maybe even before 4th of July, but that would surprise me.
Tom, I think that's really quick movement from when we talked about this, and it's already in action, so I think that's great.
In terms of potential future agenda items, something that came to mind just recently was after putting the Kobe Bryant jersey on for the playoffs, I got to go see him play Golden State. The thought had crossed my mind, now being on the Historic Preservation Commission, if there's anything we as a city should, could, would do to honor the fact that Kobe and his friends and his daughter and her friends died in our city almost 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago. This takes a lot of careful consideration. There's a lot of layers to this, of course. The family's input, approval would be needed, but just food for thought. Again, Lakers are in the Western Conference Finals. They're playing in the playoffs here in LA for the first time since Kobe passed. So I'll leave you with that parting thought. That goes to staff too. I don't want to impose, but of course, being a lifelong Laker fan, I would have never thought that Kobe would have passed away here in my city. So.
Okay. See a lot of nods up here.
I just want, typically for an item, if this group wants something to actually come to a future meeting, ideas obviously come one by one from individual members, but it's nice to know if we have a consensus on whether an idea presented by a member is something the group supports. So am I detecting a consensus here or what?
Well, I'll speak to that. Yes, I think that's a great idea. It is a part of the history of Calabasas.
Sure.
It's only a 3-year-old history in terms of that tragedy, but it is compared to other things happening 3 years ago, it's one of the things that may be remembered decades from now or more.
We could possibly name something after him here in the city. That
That's a
may
good
not
idea.
be historic preservation necessarily, the way we've been talking about it, but it would give recognition to him.
Maybe a street. Yeah.
Just food for thought. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I think it's great if
just
this
he's an
commission
inspiration,
wants
not
to-
just locally, but as an inspiration, not just locally, but globally. Yeah, I think that this would be something many people would appreciate. But again, there are lots of nuances to this, so I want the city to recognize that before we go into this head first.
So as long as the record shows that this Pacers fan is not going to hold bias against this idea, kidding aside,
As a
we'll
board-
I'm certainly happy to ask this question through the chain of command, as it were. this touches on issues besides history. It also involves more than just Kobe Bryant. Obviously, it involves 7 others and their families. So we would want to weigh very carefully. There are some people that would rather not have anything, I'm sure of that. So it's a great idea. Now, it's hard to believe in my mind. It's been 3 years. Still seemed like yesterday, but we'll bring it up.
Okay. How we doing? Everybody good? Okay, I think we had a great meeting. Very informative. So I'd like to make a motion to adjourn. Anybody?
I second that.
Okay, can we have a vote? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
5-0. Motion passes.
Thank
We are
you.
adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission.